Welcome to the future in this year's wildest, super fun show for adults.
Hey gang, it's Josh Olson.
And Joe Dante.
And we want to tell you about our podcast. It's about movies.
Josh, there are 1,000 podcasts about movies.
Sure, but ours is different, Joe.
That's true, actually. Our guests are writers, directors, musicians, comedians, actors.
Hell, we even have other podcasters on.
We play no favorites, and they don't talk so much about their own work, but about the movies that have influenced them and made them who they are. We call it The Movies That Made Me.
We've talked with people like Guillermo del Toro, Little Stevie Van Zandt, Martin Short, Ethan Hawke, William Friedkin, Barbara Crampton, Jonathan Ross, Dennis Lehane, Mark Duplass, Adam McKay, Lorraine Newman, Jason Reitman, Alison Anders, Elijah Wood, Stephen Canals, Eli Roth, Joe Bob Briggs, Roger Corman, Bobcat Goldthwait, Ileana Douglas, Dana Gould, Martin Campbell, Shane Black, Albert Hughes, Emily Deschanel, Jello Biafra, Larry Fessenden, Nicole Housen, Shaka King, Lee Daniels, Rosalind Chow, Clancy Brown, Yardley Smith, Ike Barinholtz, Steve Arquette, Thomas Middleton, Jim Prince, Lightfoot, and Uwe Boll.
It may not be highbrow, but it's lots of fun.
Subscribe for free on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get podcasts.
In color to thrill you as never before.
What up, guys? This is Henry Zamota, Danny Abdel-Jabbar. Welcome to another episode of Bro History. So first and foremost, want to make a quick announcement. This will be the last episode of the year. So the reason being is because we need to focus on making content for 2023, and we need time to do that. And we also want to spend time with our families during Christmas and the holiday season and New Year's. So this is going to be the last episode. Sorry for the 2-week cadence here. We're trying to solve that issue by getting content ready. But this is the 5th and final episode. I think it's number 5, right? Did we do 4 or 5? I'm losing count.
Something like that.
Jesus Christ. I can't even keep count. So what? Episode number 1 was the alliance system. Episode number 2 was the naval race. 3 was politics in Serbia. And 4 was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. So 5, this is the aftermath. So this is the period of time between Archduke Ferdinand getting murdered and the war going global. So that is the purpose of this episode in our Causes of World War I series. So if you listen to all of them, congratulations. We are at the end. If this is the first time you've been listening to this, I think you'll actually be able to listen to this one more so than the others by itself, but still encourage you to listen to those as well. Because we're picking up essentially where like your history books pick up. But there's about 10 hours of context that are leading up to this episode, so you may want to get that. So I'm going to start this show by giving a quick summary of the last couple of episodes. We started the series with the creation of a united Germany that immediately became the greatest industrial power in Europe, which throws the current balance of power in Europe for a loop. However, despite being a major economic and military power, this German state still has some major problems. First and foremost, in the process of creating this German empire or this German nation state, they annexed territory from France, Alsace-Lorraine, during the Franco-Prussian War, which causes the French government to be swept up in revanchism against Germany. They were very bitter about losing this important industrial area. And the political rhetoric in France throughout the 1800s and early 19th century is very anti-German. Politicians really couldn't even have any real power without having kind of a hostile stance against Germany. They wanted their territory back. Also, Germany was scary to them because they had a larger population and a way higher industrial output. They were like the old money replacing the new money, the new money replacing the old money is a way that a lot of historians may crudely put it sometimes, but it's a rivalry dynamic that grows. Now, the other big problem for Germany was that it was surrounded. Germany's kind of a crappy place to put a nation state. And I think we've talked about this in our previous episodes. You're putting it sandwiched between 2 or 3 empires. You're putting it between France, Russia, and the Habsburg Empire. You have France in the west, and you have Austria-Hungary on the south, and you have Russia on the east. So the German policy in the Bismarck era was to isolate France by keeping Russia and Austria on the same page. The big fear was one of them would ally with France, and Germany would be completely surrounded by enemies. So to make a long story short, Russia and Austria have conflicting policies in the Balkans, which put them at odds with each other, as they're both trying to fill this vacuum of power that was created or that was caused by the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Bismarck is the person who's kind of handling this alliance system. When he's sacked and eventually dies soon after, Germany kind of overtly or clearly kind of sends a message that they're tilting more in an Austrian direction, which eventually causes Russia to ally with France. So the big fear happened. At the same time, Germany gets into a naval arms race with Britain. Since Germany was such a strong continental power, there was a popular way of thinking in like the German elite circles that Germanic culture and language should be spread throughout the entire world. You see France and you see the British. They have these vast empires overseas. They have this world influence. We're the mega power in Europe. Why aren't we the ones who are kind of holding the world together and spreading our own language and culture around the world? This leads to a naval arms race with the British, and this is what we get. We get this bipolar system where the British tilt and they make friends with their old imperial rivals. Most of British foreign policy was anti-Russian throughout the 1800s. They tilt to be more, not necessarily pro-Russia, but more pro-France, who was allied with Russia. And there you have it. You have this system that becomes bipolar, went from multipolar to bipolar. And the quote that I'll use from Christopher Clark's book, which we've used in other ones, but I think it kind of sums up the dynamic so perfectly. If you compare a diagram of the alliances among the European great powers in 1887 with a similar map for the year 1907, you see the outlines of transformation. The first diagram reveals a multipolar system in which a plurality of forces and interests balance each other in precarious equilibrium. Move forward 20 years to a diagram of the European alliances in 1907, and the picture has changed utterly. You see a bipolar Europe, or organized around two alliance systems. The polarization of Europe's geopolitical system was a crucial precondition for the war that broke out in 1914. It is almost impossible to see how a crisis in Austro-Serbian relations, however grave, could have dragged the Europe of 1887 into a continental war. The bifurcation into two alliance blocks did not cause the war. Indeed, it did as much to mute as to escalate conflicts in pre-war years. Yet without two blocks, the war could not have broken out in the way that it did. The bipolar system structured the environment in which the crucial decisions were made. The major theme that we've been talking about in some of the previous episodes is a transformation from a multipolar world to a bipolar world, rather than, I think a lot of people in the current context, when they're trying to really, defend the concept of the unipolar world, meaning the unipolar world where there's one mega nation state or hyperpower that kind of controls everything, basically the way the United States is, how a lot of neoconservatives think. They'll look back in World War I. Well, when you have a multipolar system, when you have this type of system, everyone just goes to hell and fights and goes to war with each other. So you need this mega power to bring peace, to be the kind of that policeman and that watchdog who enforces contracts, who enforces obligations. So that's, an argument. And I guess, you can even make the argument that every multipolar world will eventually become a bipolar world. Those are arguments that in theories that, you can take from what you want and agree with what you want. But those are just kind of concepts in foreign policy. Now, back to World War I, and we spent a lot of time talking about the crisis in the Balkans. We probably spent the majority of this series talking about the politics in Serbia, the politics in Austria-Hungary, the Serbian threat, the fanning of Pan-Slavism in the Balkans, and how there was these overwhelming nationalist societies that they were expansionist, really. The murder of Archduke Ferdinand and his wife Sophie on June 28th, it finally sets the pretext for Austria-Hungary to finally deal with this Serbian threat with an actual military intervention. It was basically a 9/11 type event. It completely changed the chemistry in Austria, and the war power was able to, the war parties were really able to take over. Mind you, every single country in Europe had a very powerful war party. Like every single one, from Britain to Germany to Russia to Italy to Austria. They all had very powerful and influential, with key leadership, war parties that were pushing for some type of conflict for their own reasons. So this 9/11 type event, that's kind of one of Christopher Clark's theses in his book, is that he calls it a 9/11 type event, the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It creates that war, that pretext for the Hawks to say, we knew it. We should have dealt with this a long time ago. It's time to go in now, go in hard, and launch these Serbian nationalists to the sun. That was the mentality. And which was interesting as well, because Archduke Franz Ferdinand, he wasn't really necessarily super anti-Slavic. He actually was one of the guys who wanted to bring a triarchy where they would have a third royal elite with the Southern Slavs. But in order to do that, they had to be, even-handed with the Serbians and the South Slavics in the borders of Austria-Hungary. But, the Serbians found that as a threat as well. But don't want to get too bogged down in that. You can listen to that episode if you want to learn more about that piece. The point is, this sets the pretext. And one of the main reasons that Franz Ferdinand was actually in Bosnia in the first place, which is kind of overlooked, is that he was actually a troop inspector. So there was plans for the Austrians to invade Serbia prior to Franz Ferdinand even being assassinated. He was there inspecting, soldiers who they weren't fully mobilized on the borders ready to attack, but they were definitely maneuvering within the borders of Bosnia, getting ready for that outcome that they really thought was likely. The Austrians were very aware of the Black Hand organization. There's lots of documentation where there's Austrian diplomats talking about these kind of weird intelligence apparatuses in Serbia that are basically part of the Serbian security apparatus. In a modern day context, the Black Hand organization reminds me a lot of the right sector in Ukraine. There's a lot of comparisons where they're hyper nationalist and they're kind of in the state security apparatus. So the Austrians knew this. They had people on the ground. They knew that Gavrilo Princip, the murderer, one of the conspirators or regiciders, the guy who actually pulled off the assassination, they knew that he was sponsored by this organization, which may as well just made him an active agent of the Serbian government. Even though this was a covert action, there still was this layer of plausible deniability. But the question really is how much did the leadership of the Serbian government know about this plot? The problem is with that question is that we don't really know. like, unfortunately, the Black Hand organization, they were, they basically destroyed most of their records. So we don't know how close they were, but I think you can speculate that there was a pretty strong relationship between the state. It's not necessarily where you have, like, the prime minister of Serbia directing them to do that, but a lot of times these secret institutions, they take on a life of their own. So that was enough for the Austrians to blame the entire Serbian state. Now, before they decided on a military intervention, they obviously had to go to their allies. And, their big brother at the time is Germany. So they sent their ambassadors to Berlin to make sure that they had essentially their unconditional support if they were to go to war. And, what's interesting about this period, this is known as the July Crisis, the period between, right after Archduke Ferdinand is murdered, and then the period where, the war is actually declared. The fact that there's kind of like these diplomatic channels going on, the fact that, the process is delayed is what a lot of historians will say caused the situation to get so bad. It made the crisis fester, and it gave these states time to do more stupid things, really. It gave time for these states to really mobilize and kind of pull the trigger. There's some who will say, hey, if Austria-Hungary went into Serbia right away and there was a quick defeat, then there would have been no global war. Because the Austrians themselves, there's no evidence to suggest the Austrians wanted to get into some large-scale European war. The only thing that they were really concerned. Well,
and it's funny that you make that argument, because we'll talk in a bit about the Schlieffen plan, but the German plans to quickly invade France later. Some historians and like alt historians argue that they should have let it. They shouldn't have mobilized so quickly, and they should have just let it chill out and let some diplomatic stuff happen first, so that they can prepare better. Which is interesting. There's arguments on both sides. It's like people arguing that you had to go in fast and hit them hard, and then we'd avoid World War I, or no, you needed to let it simmer for a little while longer and get better prepared so that we can avoid a larger protracted war. It's really funny how that works out, and that's just kind of like the fun part of doing topics like these, because you come up and find all of these interesting alt history theories of like, well, what if this happened and what if that happened? And, the truth is that we'll never really know, but it's fun to think about anyway.
Yeah. And there's so much information to really pull from that. The problem with this topic is that there's too much information. Like there's, if you're doing something on the 30-year war, mm-hmm. You're just like, okay, like I can just kind of read Wikipedia, honestly, right. And I'll probably get the most accurate story that I can maybe possibly get, unless I'm like an actual geologist or something who's like looking at bullets on the ground floor of the battlefields. But like there's not as many sources, so you're kind of forced to just take the narrative. A lot of those sources in the 30-year war would be in German anyway. Now, here there's just like there's thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of documents. After the war, there was basically like a giant tribunal on the public stage for who was guilty, and obviously Germany is the one that's declared guilty. I mean, they released something like a 40,000 page document or whatever. Their evidence that why they weren't to blame, and how it was actually, France and Russia who were the main instigators of the war. But nevertheless, Germany is blamed for the war. But we'll get down to that. We'll get to that later. Where was I? Talking about
Germany supporting Austria.
Okay, yeah. So Germany's supporting Austria. So where I left off was, the crisis made a time to fester. There's like a series of letters and exchanges and by, German and Austrian diplomats. And I'm not going to pretend to be an expert about all the different meetings and all the different documents and exchanges that took place between Germany and Austria, over this 5-day period. But I do know that by July 5th, historians call this the blank check. So the Germans pledged their unconditional assistance to support the Austrians. They basically told them, go deal with them. This is time to just act now, do it. Just do it, get it done, get in and out. And let us know if you need something. Let us know if you need something. We got your back. We get it. So go for it. Now here's the problem. This is the mechanism that starts. So you got your Archduke assassinated. The Austrians, they wanted to deal with this Serbian problem for a while. They hated the Serbs. The Serbs hated them. And they just, the writing was on the wall. They were going to come to blow with them. The problem was that the Serbs' big brother was the Russians. And any Austrian military action was most likely, it wasn't certain, but it was most likely going to trigger a Russian military mobilization. And a Russian military mobilization would 100% trigger a German military response. At this point, Germany's big fear was Russia. Like that was their future forecast. Their risk forecast was, we're all good and stuff, but eventually, Russia is going to become this major monster imperial or industrial power that will rival us because their population is about 140 million people. We have 60 million people. I might be getting those population numbers incorrect, but the point is the Russian population was massive. They weren't the industrial power that Germany was, but they potentially could. And of course, they were building things like railroads in the in Western Russia, the Russian part, the Russia that's part of Europe. So they were, that was like a future threat to them. So any type of Russian mobilization was going to trigger that. They had almost gone to war in the past, where the German military staff had tried to convince the Kaiser to take military action against Russia in multiple occasions, throughout the late 1800s. So this was something that was on their mind. The Germans felt, and this was probably the correct assumption, if a general war broke out due to the Balkans crisis, the timing actually had kind of worked out for them. They felt that the German army and the Navy was at its peak strength. Meanwhile, they believed that France and Russia were not really ready for war yet. And they did not think at all that the British would intervene. There's a quote, and I think this is from, I forget which German general said this, but it was along the lines of, what if the British get involved? And, well, if the British get involved, I'll arrest them. We won't even have to send the army, or we'll just send our police to arrest your soldiers. So they just thought it was an afterthought. Britain is a naval power. They're not a continental massive army like the Germans are. So there was a feeling in Germany that if Vienna didn't take action immediately against the Serbs, the crisis would fester on, and eventually they would get pulled into some sort of conflict later on when the balance of military power was going to be less favorable for them. Therefore, Germany assured their complete support for Austria. They urged them to take action ASAP, and they encouraged them to do that even if it were to pull Russia into this conflict. What's funny is that it took longer for the Austrian government to persuade the Hungarian ministers of the need for military intervention in Serbia than it did to persuade the Germans. So they're the actual people who share the state with them, but I think the Hungarians were more so concerned that if they went ahead and conquered Serbia, then there would be a lot more Serbs in the Habsburg Empire, and that they definitely didn't want to tip the balance of power within the Habsburg Empire to like a third, South Slav part of the realm. But, there's also a lot of conflicting messages as well. As there's a lot of documents that, kind of show a much more complex narrative. And I'm sure the narrative is a lot more complex than even how we're portraying it right now, as in the Germans are just pushing them. Ralph Rako, I'm going to read a quote from him. Scholars have now available to them the diary of Kurt Reisler, private secretary to German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg. From this and other documents, it becomes clear that Bethmann Hollweg's position in the July crisis was a complex one. If Austria were to vanish as a power, Germany would be threatened by rampant pan-Slavism supported by growing Russian power in the east and by French revanchism in the west. By prompting the Austrians to attack Serbia immediately, he hoped that the conflict would be localized and the Serbian menace nullified. The Chancellor, too, understood that the Central Powers were risking a continental war, but he believed that if Austria acted swiftly, presenting Europe with a rapid fait accompli, the war could be confined to the Balkans and the intervention of a third party avoided as much as possible. In this way, the German-Austrian alliance could emerge with a stunning political victory that might split the Entente and crack Germany's encirclement. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, it just highlights, in my opinion, the going narrative that, they wanted Germany, that is, they wanted to get it done faster because protracting it any longer would potentially create an imbalance of power, a rallying of a bunch of the other empires that they happen to be surrounded by. To your point earlier, they're kind of in a shitty spot in Europe. They were just like, let's just get it over with now, rip off the Band-Aid while we think we're strong. Kind of a miscalculation on a whole lot of fronts, but I mean, history and the past being hindsight being 2020, it's easy for us to sit here and judge them on that decision. But I guess, trying to put myself in their shoes, I probably think the same.
Another thing is that, and they knew this as well, is that there was rampant germophobia. Germophobia, like scared of germs. Germanophobia. There's rampant Germanophobia in a lot of governments. Probably less so on the Russian side, more so on the French and British side. Even on the American side as well. Austria, they give Serbs an ultimatum. They draw up a list of 10 demands to which the Serbian government would have to capitulate to. Some argue that the list of demands was so strict that they knew they wouldn't be able to accept them. And these demands included things like the suppression of anti-Austrian propaganda, the dissolution of the Serbian Nationalist Association, the Black Hand, the purging of officials and army officers guilty of spreading malicious propaganda against Austria, and then the tightening up of controls on the Serb Austro-Hungarian frontiers and the participation of Habsburg officials in a Serbian inquiry into the circumstances surrounding the atrocity. So, the text of the ultimatum was agreed on July 19th, but wasn't presented to the Serbian government until July 23rd. So that's 4 weeks after the assassination had already taken place.
They're really dragging their feet about it.
So this guy's dead and buried.
Yeah.
For a while, for 3 weeks at this point. Part of the reason for this delay, there was a long-planned state visit to St. Petersburg by the French leadership at the time.
Right.
And it was scheduled to take place between July 20th to the 23rd. And they didn't want to give, the heads up of they didn't want to give a chance for the heads of the Russian and French government to cooperate and collaborate in person. So they wanted to wait until the meeting concluded before moving forward with something. And when the Austrians finally give the Serbs their demands, they only give them 48 hours to respond. The British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey, he describes the Austrian ultimatum as the most formidable document I'd ever seen addressed by one state to another.
Formidable document.
The most formidable document. It's, legend goes is that
it's the best document.
When
best
Gray,
document.
the best document. When Gray was actually reading it, the British government was like, "Oh shit, this is going to happen, isn't it?" that was sort of the reaction. They're like, "Oh, because I think the first couple of weeks the British were like, I think this is going to blow over." Mm-hmm. And then they were like, "Oh no, this is going to happen, isn't it?" And we're going to be pulled into it.
Hi, I'm Matt Albers, host of the Pirate History Podcast. The men and women of the golden age of piracy are some of the most infamous and often misunderstood characters in all of human history. You know their names: Captain Morgan, Anne Bonny, Henry Avery, Mary Read, Captain Kidd, Blackbeard. But do you know their stories, their real stories? Every week over on the Pirate History Podcast, we explore the real lives of these pirates. We examine what made these pirates sail the high seas in search of plunder and adventure and revenge. The real stories are a lot more complex and a lot more interesting than the stories most of us have been told. If you'd like to hear the stories of the real men and women who went on the account and sailed under the black flag, join us on the Pirate History Podcast.
I want to take a moment to tell you guys about my podcast called The Team House. My name's Jack Murphy. I'm a former Ranger and Green Beret, and I've worked as a national security journalist for the last 10 years. The Team House is a natural extension of that, where I interview former spies and special operations personnel from all over the world. These are exclusive interviews from people who work in the shadows and come a little bit into the light for these exclusive interviews that we do every week, live streamed on YouTube at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And they're available as video on demand and audio on demand wherever you listen to podcasts.
So the Russians asked the Austrians to extend the amount of time they had to reply to their demands. Meanwhile, they told the Serbian government to just comply with the Austrians. So they were just like, hey, listen, we're going to have to handle this. Just don't do anything stupid. Don't, act like heroes right now. Even if the Austrians invade, don't resist. Just let this be handled by, the great powers of Europe. Let's handle it diplomatically. Just sit down and hold tight for now. I think the Austrian government thought that the Russians would be more kind of grossed out by the murder of the Archduke Ferdinand. Mm-hmm. But so, they would be like, all right, you're right to go ahead. But maybe they guess they calculated wrong. Meanwhile, the rest of Europe was still waiting on this Serbian response. What are they going to do? Are they going to listen to the ultimatum or not? So just before, this is 6 p.m. on July 25th, the Serbians submit their response, and the Serbian government was prepared to capitulate to 9 of the Austrian demands. So 9 out of 10 demands they were going to capitulate to. But they objected to one, and that was the participation of Austrian officials in the murder investigation of Archduke Ferdinand.
That's like the one that they probably wanted the most. Like, they probably could have just said yeah to that and no to everything else, and Austria probably would have taken it. Why didn't they just let them do that?
I don't know. It's probably because they would have figured out that
they were involved.
Government was sponsoring them. I can only speculate, but I'm speculating. I don't know the full story about why they did this, but I'm speculating that the the Serb, the Black Hand group was deeper in with the state than the Austrians probably even knew at the time. Like, I think they're like, oh fuck, like a lot of us are going to be arrested. Like, because think about it, they're going to come in. Anyone who's involved in a regicide, in the murder of an archduke, anyone is probably going to be killed. It's going to be put in firing squad and executed. So
of course,
they're going to be trialed. So it's going to be impacting, like, probably a lot of people. It could have been just, you got to think about how wild these types of trials will go as well. If they come in there.
I was just saying, like we were just talking earlier about how good the Black Hand was at covering their tracks, and even just like talking about the actual murder of Archduke Ferdinand was really hard, because one of the points that we brought up in that episode was that a lot of the story that led up to it was not really talked about until well after the war had ended, and there wasn't a whole lot of documentation or paperwork or paper trails around this. So, even though it's widely accepted that the Serbians were supporting the Black Hand and the Bosnian Serbian terrorists in that respect, I think everyone agrees on that. It was always very difficult to pin them down with absolute certainty. So, it makes me think. This is why I had such a visceral reaction to them not agreeing to that one term out of all 10 of those terms, is that I feel like, and again, hindsight is 20/20, but I feel like the Serbians could have just been like, all right, fine, you guys can do an investigation, and either just obstruct the investigation slyly enough, or that, it makes me double think the Black Hand secrecy, because up until this point, we're kind of going on the operating assumption that they're actually pretty sneaky, but
they're an open secret that doesn't leave a paper trail behind them, but they're still known. They're still a known group. Like the Austrian, we were talking about this, a couple episodes ago, where the Austrians had known about them already. Like they had already had their diplomats talking about them, saying, hey, like there's this real crazy group there that we're pretty sure is connected to the state. And they're funding a lot of these wars in throughout the Balkans right now. They're training and arming Serb nationalists. So they had known that much. So imagine some Habsburg official coming into Serbia, very nationalist society, and then pushing them around and like, oh right, we're going to investigate you, and what do you think those interrogations would look like? They beat the crap out of them until they confess or something, or give somebody up or flip on somebody. So I think that the reason why they denied this is because it would implicate probably a lot of people who didn't want to get implicated and hung. That's my reasoning for that, because we're talking about direct consequences for the people who, anyone who was involved. And I was trying to make the point before, how these investigations go. These can get pretty wild. I'm sure people can be blamed and flipped on who had nothing to do with anything of the Archduke Ferdinand and the Black Hand, but maybe because they spoke with somebody at the wrong time and there was a photograph of it, then this guy is guilty as charged. So these investigations can be quite humiliating.
Mm-hmm. They could have just Lee Harvey Oswald somebody, just pin it on some guy and then have it be over.
Just get your Jack Rubenstein to come out and kill him, and then no one asks a question ever again about what happened.
Right. Yeah, we're like, oh, it was this guy. Oh,
sorry,
funny story
he died.
about this guy. He fell out a window with a bullet in his head.
Sorry, guys, he died. Let's just stop talking about this.
He's dead.
No, what does it matter? What do you care about? He already someone killed him. Who cares?
Yeah, he's dead already.
He's dead already. Who cares? Shut up. They I think I've only passingly read this, so maybe I'm not right on the facts, but apparently the Biden administration denied declassifying certain JFK-related documents.
Yeah, that's true, because we were coming up on that 50-year term limit or whatever, whatever the rule was that in 50 years they'd have to release more information. And you're right, I haven't thought about that in a while, and I guess,
I think if you poll Americans, I think the majority of Americans believe that the story about JFK is like,
CIA
at the very least, it is not it's not the full story. I don't think anyone believes it's the full story. But I guess that's a spectrum of like, do you think that it was the CIA or do you think it was aliens? I guess there's kind of a weird spectrum because there's a lot of kooky
It is
people.
a pretty broad stroke of shit conspiracy theories that you get with that.
Because you get two types of conspiracies. Well, not two, but generally speaking, there's conspiracy theorists who are actually like, smart and educated and do hundreds and hundreds of hours of research. And, they put some real legitimate theories. You're like, oh man, that could be it. And then there's crazy people like Alex Jones types who will just word vomit everything and, not make much sense and make other conspiracy theorists look like idiots and crazy people. So they filter. So a lot of the crazy JFK stuff kind of filters in with the
really crazy conspiracy theories.
with like the things that could be more legitimate. It's a lot like 9/11, how you get like these nut jobs who think that a missile hit the Pentagon and stuff, and they kind of mix and kind of take away from the real scandal of working with these Al Qaeda guys. Through years. So it's all right. We're going way too off point. We're getting away from World War I, so we got to go back. I'm going to talk about. So I have a quote. It's a good time for a quote. So historian Ruth Hennig, whether the Serbs were prepared to run the risk of Austrian attack because of assurances of help they had secured from the Russian government is not definitely established. Nor is it clearly known whether or not they might have accepted all the demands had Russia had put strong pressure on them to do so. Certainly the Serbs had gone most of the way, if not all, towards meeting the Austrian demands. When the Kaiser was later told in the details of the Serbian reply, he declared that the grounds for an Austro-Hungarian invasion had been removed, though he added that in his view, the Austro-Hungarians would still need to occupy Belgrade until such time as the Serbs were actually seen to be carrying out their promises. So, on July 25th, Austria is starting to order their mobilization. They will mobilize about 7 army corps against Serbia. They actually mobilize another corps against Italy because they fucking knew Italy was going to backstab them. And everyone, it was like the open secret that Italy was gonna, the whole thing
Those
about Italy.
sneaky Italians, they can't be trusted.
Well, they had some real nut jobs in head of the Italian government at that time.
Yeah.
And they knew how there was like so much hatred because there was disputed territory up in northern, in the Alps. And there were some real whack jobs who were heading the Italian government in basically through the first half of the 20th century. But I digress. And that might be a future episode, but not part of the series. You see, it would take a few weeks to get ready to invade. The Austrian government was, they were getting anxious to make a formal declaration. There were efforts by the British to try to convince the Austrians to calm down. I think, Edward Grey, the foreign secretary, who, at first he does turn into a real war hawk later on, but at first he was, advocating for some level of kind of diplomacy between Austria, Germany, and Russia. The British try to pressure some type of meeting of the great powers, with France, Germany, Italy, Russia, Vienna, Austria, to have something to stop from this mobilization process. But this attempt in creating a peace conference actually backfires. What it does is that it signals to the Austrians that they had to actually settle this dispute faster than they thought they did. So they actually kind of hasten and speed up the process. The German government then told the British that this could only be settled by direct negotiations between Austria and Russia. And the British were like, well, what the fuck? Like, that's not going to do anything. Everyone knows that they're not going to go to war if you guys don't have their back.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's you're the power here. You're the first-rate power, not the Austrians. And that kind of puts Russia in a bad, puts Germany in a bad situation, because it puts them in. So it's basically like Germany is basically Heisenberg watching Jesse's girlfriend die of an overdose and doing nothing. If you get the Breaking Bad reference.
Unfortunately, I don't. I never actually watched Breaking Bad.
All right. I should run by my TV show references before.
Someone might, though.
I'm sure somebody will get that reference and be like, oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about. The point is, there's a scene in Breaking Bad where someone didn't see it. I don't want to spoil it now. Now I'm conflicted.
Just go ahead. At this point, it's been so many years since the show had ended that if I haven't
already
seen it,
said this thing would happen.
Yeah.
The point I'm trying to make is that they could have stopped it, but they didn't. And the German Chancellor, Holdweg, he writes to the Austrian government. Having already declined the English plan for a conference, it is impossible for us entirely to reject this suggestion as well. By refusing every mediatory action, we should make ourselves responsible before the whole world and should appear as the real authors of war. That would make our position impossible at home, where we must appear to have war forced upon us. Our situation is all more difficult since Serbia has apparently given away a great deal. We cannot therefore decline the role of mediator and must forward the English proposal to the Vienna cabinet for consideration. Here's the problem. By the time this telegram reaches Vienna, the Austrian government already declared war. So it's July 28th. This is when the war actually, the official start day of World War I. And by July 29th, so the next day, they start to bomb Belgrade. So they were able to send ships through the Sava River, and they're able to shoot them with guns from the river. So they already start their, at least bombing campaign. So in response to this, the Russians begin to, they begin their military mobilization. They mobilize 4 military districts, Odessa, Kiev, Moscow, and Kazan, which were they were the closest districts to Austria. And the thinking in Russian elite circles was leaving Serbia out to dry would cause serious damage to Russian credibility, when judged by the international community, especially after Russia failed to stand up to the German states, so Austria and Germany, when they annexed Bosnia in 1909. They came out of this huge scandal where the Russian public found out that the government was making deals with the Austrians behind closed door to annex Bosnia, that had a huge population of Serbs, and it just caused a big disaster. So it's almost kind of a domestic political issue for them at this point, where they can't be caught looking weak on the Serb issue because there's so many Serb supporters. So Russia's main political goal at this time, too, was having better access to the Turkish Straits, and they eventually, their dream was to become the predominant power in Constantinople. They wanted to, be one of the main exploiters of the falling and declining Ottoman Empire.
That's funny because Russia's main political goal, I feel like, is still to have really good access to the Turkish Straits. So,
changes. Hey, you can't move. Your countries never change in terms of like where they're located. So those geography goals or geopolitical goals are always going to sort of remain the same, if you know what I'm saying. So I mean, the same geopolitical goal for Russia today was the same one as Stalin, is to have a buffer state between the West, or have buffers between the West. So a German dominated Balkans would be a threat to these objectives. The goal with mobilization from the Russia side, what they were hoping was that this would ultimately deter Austria from invading and maybe bring them to the negotiating table. But remember, this was just a partial mobilization at first. The Russian general staff was upset about this. They said, "Hey, what are you doing? Why are we only going through a partial mobilization when we should be doing a full mobilization? And this is going to be totally necessary if we're going to get into a war with Germany." And they were ultimately concerned that if they had to, let's just say a war broke out and then they were transitioning from a partial mobilization to a full mobilization, Germany would be able to respond to take advantage of it. And ultimately, a partial mobilization would trigger a German mobilization in the first place. So, they were like, we might as well just go play it big. Like, why are we doing half measures right here? And the reason why one of the other reasons too, and I don't want to skip this, is that the French were in their ears as well. The French government was telling the Russians, like, hey man, you need to fully mobilize and get ready for war.
Shit's about to go down.
Like, shit's about to go down. The French were thinking, and the French kind of knew this, the Germans would probably go after them first. So if the Germans went after France, they were like, hey, Russia, the goal, if they attack, you got to get ready because you need to attack East Prussia as soon as possible. The fear that we sandwich them. So we got to take advantage of the sandwich move.
German sandwich action.
So the French government, was aware too that it would take the Russians about 3 or 4 weeks to complete their mobilization. Therefore, they pressured the Russian government to authorize this general mobilization as quickly as possible. Now, remember, in the background of all this going on, these monarchs are all related. They're all cousins, and they're all friendly cousins too. They're not like, oh, that's my. They spend time with each other. The British, the Russian, and the German monarchs are all cousins with each other. So Tsar Nicholas II, he sends a telegram to Kaiser Wilhelm, pleading for his help in squashing this potential war. And he writes, "In this most serious moment, I appeal to you to help me. As ignoble war has been declared to a weak country, the indignation in Russia shared fully by me is enormous. I foresee that very soon I shall be overwhelmed by the pressure brought upon me and be forced to take extreme measures which will lead to war. To try and avoid such a calamity as a European war, I beg you in the name of our old friendship to do what you can to stop your allies from going too far. Signed, Nicky."
Oh, Nicky. Trying to do the right thing.
Yeah. Well, what's funny is that he prevents the full mobilization. So he's about to carry out the full mobilization, which he knows that will absolutely trigger a war. And he stops because they receive a letter back, a friendly reply from his cousin Willie. So Willie is Kaiser Wilhelm. And, he writes, "With regards to the hearty and tender friendship which binds us both from long ago with firm ties, I'm exerting my utmost influence to arrive at a satisfactory understanding with you. I confidently hope you will help me in my efforts to smooth over difficulties that may still arise. Your very sincere and devoted friend and cousin, Willie.
Oh, Willie.
But again, the problem was a partial mobilization by Russia was enough to be a major threat interpreted by the German military authorities. And, the thing was, and the Germans knew this, Serbia was a much smaller country than the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. But they certainly were not a pushover country. It wasn't like something that they would be able to, let's just send a couple occupy, we'll just walk in there. The Serbians had a veteran army. They had a very good military academy. They had a professional, they were professionals. They outnumbered them, and they had way more industrial capacity. But I mean, they were going to fight some pretty hardcore nationalist types, and they were not going to go down. The Serbs can fight. The Serbs were the number one resistors to the Nazi occupation. It wasn't going to be a cakewalk for them, and the Germans knew that the Austrians would have to commit a large number of troops for this invasion. So, German military planning had assumed that in a situation of a general war between the Central Powers in France and Russia, the Austrians would cover Germany's eastern flank by launching an offensive against Russia, in what is now Poland. And that would leave Germany able to just go ahead and concentrate on France in a big, great Western offensive. If Austrian troops were instead fully committed to the Balkans, the German eastern borders would be left vulnerable to a Russian attack, which would, ultimately endanger the Schlieffen plan, which we're going to get into. So you get a situation where the German chancellor was actually trying to pull the brakes on Austrian preparations. The political leadership was trying to pull the brakes. But meanwhile, the German chief of staff in Moltke was urging the Austrians to announce a general mobilization against Russia, and was also, promising unqualified German support, in this European war that was likely to break out. And, the Austrians didn't really need that. The Austrians did not need much convincing on this. So, at this point, Russian military authorities were extremely worried that, they were not going to be able to take on a German attack. The Austrians were mobilizing, and the rumors were going around. The Germans were starting to as well. The Germans are going to be able to mobilize much faster, and the Tsar starts to buckle under pressure from France in his own military. And on July 30th, he ordered the general mobilization. And at this point, a war was now inevitable. The German military machine was revving up for action, and Germany demanded that Russia cease all military activities that were aimed against Austria, and within they requested a reply in 12 hours. The Russians did not reply, so they declared war on them on August 1st. So that's where the general continental war starts.
It's kind of hard to believe that we've been doing this for like 10 straight hours and just to get to this point, and I feel like we probably left so much out.
I mean, no, we didn't probably lose so much off. We left an unconceivable amount out of this.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Well, here's one thing that we still haven't talked in great detail about, and that's the Schlieffen plan.
Yeah, and let me just preface this. This is really important because we're talking about World War I. This is not a world war yet. This is how the war turns into a global war. The Schlieffen plan, which was essentially the plan that was cooked up for decades past.
Hey, don't give it all away.
All right, I'm not going to give it away, but the Schlieffen plan is essentially the German plan to win the war quickly. So perhaps you can jump into this part while I drink a cup of water.
That sounds good. So, in the past 4 episodes plus 1 hour of this one, we've obviously spent a whole lot of time discussing all of the events and the factors that led up to, the start of World War I. And, obviously, if you've been listening to all of them, I don't think it's a surprise to you that Germany had drafted up a plan to go to war on 2 fronts against France and Russia. And, this plan was called the Schlieffen Plan, and it was thought up by some dude named Graf Alfred von Schlieffen, or Count Schlieffen. That's what Graf is. And he was a German field marshal and strategist he served as the chief of the Imperial German General Staff from 1891 to 1906. Now, these plans, when they were written, were strictly hypothetical, right? It's not as if there was like this plan to just like, for no good reason, go ahead and start a war first. It was more of a like if shit hits the fan, or if it looks like it's about to hit the fan, here's the plan, right? It was that kind of plan. Now, this wasn't the first set of plans for an eventual war on 2 fronts. Prior to the Schlieffen Plan, there were many other plans that were, drafted and put into place, in the German High Command. Mostly those plans consisted of basically holding the line in the West against France and proactively attacking Russia in the East. And honestly, there was a lot of really good logic for this type of approach for Germany. Because remember, when we've discussed this earlier in this podcast and probably several other times throughout the last 5 episodes, but Germany's kind of in a weird spot, right? And it's surrounded by a bunch of other superpowers. So, the question always becomes, if shit hits the fan, especially given all of these alliance systems, like we have to pick a target to attack. You can't spread yourself too thin, so you have to like focus somewhere. So those approaches, the early ones before the Schlieffen Plan, they thought, all right, if we're going to pick one, we're going to go after Russia because they look like a better target. And there's a lot of good logic, like I said, around this. Firstly, the historic route to go invade France from Germany is this relatively flat area between the Jura and Vosges mountain ranges. It's called the Belfort Gap or the Burgundian Gate. I'll refer to it as the Belfort Gap because I like that one better. And this was the route that the German armies took during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. And it's also just this historic passageway that many legions of troops have traveled through to get to the France and further onto the Iberian Peninsula from the central parts of Europe. But because of that war, though, the Franco-Prussian War in 1870.
Hey, Matt, did you know that wombats poop cubes?
Nope, never heard that before.
Did you know the unicorn is the national animal of Scotland, Ken?
I didn't know, nor do I care.
Neil, did you know that Liechtenstein is the only doubly landlocked country in Europe?
Jeff, isn't that an American pop artist?
Well, actually, it's both. If you want to learn things like that and more, join us each week on Triviality, a pub trivia-style game show podcast where a lack of seriousness meets a little bit of knowledge.
Listen in each week to answer general knowledge trivia alongside exciting guests from around the world.
And we're here too.
Join us every Tuesday for new hour-long episodes of Triviality, plus tons of extra theme content on everything from The Office and Lord of the Rings to science and geography.
And sometimes we even do sports.
Find us on all your preferred podcast apps and take part in the fun of playing bar trivia without the need to wear pants.
Real mature, Jeff.
Forget it, Neil. It's Triviality.
Yeah, Film Vault.
We are one of the original film podcasts.
That can't be true.
There was like 2 other film podcasts when we began, Brian.
How long have we doing this show?
You and I first sat down and did a version of the show over 20 years ago.
My God.
There is shtick, but it's very little shtick.
We finish each other's
sandwiches?
Close enough.
Was that a joke on a movie?
Yeah, that's from Frozen.
Oh, it is.
Pretty bad.
Ugh.
Oh, look at you.
I don't want to be like quoting Frozen on this promo.
Okay, peek behind the curtain. Anderson's
Nope.
like the Frozen guy. Like, he'll constantly reference animated films, family films, and I'm more the edgy indie guy.
We do have the tropey thing going on where Brian does like the big Hollywood sexy summer movies. I'm always looking for like the hidden gems. 2 episodes each week. One,
We review movies, and the first episode, and the second one, top 5 time. Top 5, different top 5 every week. Movies that made you cry, worst movie accents, most disturbing movies. All right, the Film Vault, check it out.
wherever you find podcasts.
That's right, the Film Vault's going on 20 plus years.
France was like, all right, well, we got to do something about this Belfort Gap. And they set out to heavily fortify the Belfort Gap by building several forts around 4 what they called frontline cities. And those 4 cities were Belfort, Epinal, Toul, and Verdun. And they basically built up these network of fortifications, and it made any attempt to just walk straight through the Belfort Gap a near impossibility for Germany or literally for anyone else. So the idea, the early plans that Germany had before the Schlieffen plan, the idea was just dig in on Germany's border with France and just hold them from advancing. That was like the main goal. Like, we're not going to be able to walk through the Belfort Gap, so we're just going to sit in place, make sure they don't make any territorial gains, and we'll focus on the east with Russia. Now, a second important point and good piece of logic for these pre-Schlieffen plans was that Germany and its ally Austria both shared borders with Russia. And this is kind of a geographic upside that wasn't present on the border with France, right? The idea is they can tag team Russia on the eastern border and knock them out of the war quickly together, right? Like, Austria doesn't border France, so they can't help them with France, really. They'd have to go through the friggin' Alps and, through Italy in order to swing around to get to them, or through Switzerland, There's no border there that they can help them with. So, that's the idea. They're going to tag team them. And some supporting logic to this play was also that the fact that the German and Austro-Hungarian armies were largely just better trained, better equipped, and much, much more mobile than the Russian forces were at the time. So they were like, oh, look, these guys are pretty weak, right? We can tag team them. So that's the obvious target, right? They're the mark. But at the end of 1905, Schlieffen starts writing up some new plans, some updated plans, right? Because things are starting to boil up. We've been talking about all of the context and all the events that had been happening around this time. So it was clear that they needed to do some sprucing up to their plans. And initially, Schlieffen's plans were pretty much the same as the ones that I just described before, like hold in the west, attack in the east. But a new assumption about Russia's army brought like a huge change to the plan. Schlieffen argued that Russia would need at least 6 weeks to do a full mobilization of their forces for an assault on Germany. So 6 weeks. And that, in his opinion, would give Germany enough time to defeat France. So he spins the idea around and he says, okay, these Russians, they got a big country. Yeah, they got a lot of people, but like by the time they get all the people from their far east all the way over here for full mobilization, it's going to be at least 6 weeks. And that should be enough time to beat France. And so he even argued, and this is kind of crazy, he said, all right, even if they are, maybe they do it a little quicker, or maybe it takes us a little longer to beat up France, and maybe Russia does make a couple of gains into, Eastern Germany. He thinks, okay, well, those will be short-lived. We'll just come back after we're done with France, and we'll take back that territory and then turn around and do a full court press on Russia. A lot of this plan really just hinged on the German army's mobility. And it's kind of smart because at least within Germany itself, there were extensive railways and paved roads. So, those things allow the Germans to move their forces around within Germany really quickly. So the plan kind of did have some legs.
But one of the reasons why Germany was so nervous about Russia was the fact that the Russians were building railroads.
Right.
So they were going to be improving those logistics. and the capital was coming from France. So they were like, oh man, like look what they're doing. France is providing the capital finance for Russian industry on our border. Like this is extremely threatening to us. The thing about Schlieffen, which is interesting, is that just on a personal level, he's just the very stereotypical Prussian like military mind. Like if you just type in a picture of him, you're just like, oh man, that guy looks like a Prussian general.
Yeah.
And allegedly, his very famous last words, he dies like on his deathbed talking about the Schlieffen plan. He's on his deathbed and he's like, remember the right flank or something like that. He says something along the lines of something on the right or cover the right flank, but he dies like talking about the Schlieffen plan. Like those are his last words. His whole life was surrounded by
this plan. I mean, he really
plan.
He was really serious about it. He thought he made the best plan ever. Schlieffen, he budgeted. This is just like the delusion of him, right? So if the context that Henry just gave you about him dying and his last dying words were about this plan really just kind of tells you how like obsessed with this plan he was. He was so crazy about it that he budgeted just 45 days to defeat all of France in this plan, and then turn around and bring the entire weight of the entire German army from France through Germany to Russia to go beat them up. Which, I mean, it's cute that he made a really strong goal, right? He's aiming high. Now, I know what you're thinking. Didn't I just say that invading France from the east through the Belfort Gap wouldn't be a walk in the park? And that part was still true. And Schlieffen knew about this. Like, it's not like new information. He knew that you can't just walk through the Belfort Gap. But he had this crazy-ass idea to literally get around that. And that idea involved going through Belgium. So there was another really good route in the Meuse Valley in Belgium, which would provide a pretty straight shot into northern France. And so Schlieffen planned to just basically wrap around and encircle Paris through the northeast of France, and basically pin them down on the other side with the forces that advance a little bit more slowly through the Belfort Gap. And for the most part, it sounded like a pretty solid plan, but they also made, again, he's making some pretty big assumptions here, pretty bad ones, really. And his assumptions were primarily around Belgium. See, Schlieffen, he assumed that Belgium would be pretty easy to roll over on their way to France. I mean, Belgium legitimately is a tiny little country, after all, Like, how could they possibly hold off the mighty German Empire, right? I mean, it's a pretty good calculation. If I was a betting man, I'd probably agree with him on that front. But it was a bad idea, and I'll get to that in a moment. So another factor that Schlieffen really didn't foresee is how would invading Belgium change the political landscape in Europe, particularly against them. And we'll get to that in a bit too. So small as Belgium was and is, they still had their own fortifications to deal with too. Nothing like the Belfort Gap, but they did have 12 forts that were defending the city of Liège, which is right in the way of their route to go to France, right? And that's not a small amount of forts, right? That's kind of like an obstacle. It's a bit of a speed bump. And then again, Schlieffen, with his crazy ass plans, he had a plan to get around that too. And that plan was to actually go even further north and invade a small part of the Netherlands to get around that fort, right? So all of Schlieffen's plans were like, put an obstacle in front of him. He's like, it's cool. I'll just go around it, right? Put another obstacle around him. It's cool. I'll just go around that one too. It's simple. It's kind of genius. It's also fucking stupid, right? Like, it's all of those things all at once. And the thing about that, though, about invading the Netherlands, right, is that you'd be fighting two countries at once at this point, right? Now you're fighting Belgium and the Netherlands at the same time. And if that might not be a problem if that's all your goal was, right? Just fighting Belgium and the Netherlands. But that wasn't the goal. The goal was to get through them to get to France, and speed is the priority. So eventually they end up dropping the Netherlands plan. That helped keep the Netherlands, neutral for the most part in the war. But somehow Schlieffen convinced everybody that these forts in Liège in Belgium weren't going to be a problem, and that they could still get it done in time, and that the German army could handle them and still somehow get to France and take Paris in 45 days. I mean, totally a stretch, but I mean, the German high command bought it, and that was the plan that they went with when shit hit the fan. So what actually went down was, in response to the German declaration of war against Russia on August 1st, the French, they obviously order a full mobilization of their own. And then the Germans mobilized shortly after that, and they sent a message to Paris and said, yo, remain neutral or else. And of course, that got ignored. 2 days later, on August 3rd, Germany declares war on France, right? And at the same time, Germany hits up King Albert of Belgium, who at the time is still neutral, and he basically demands that they just open up their doors and let the Germans walk through Belgium or else, right? So they're making a lot of threats here. And then, King Albert, he doesn't take their shit, and he immediately orders a full mobilization. So now Belgium is no longer neutral, and they have a full mobilization. Less than a day later, Germany obviously invades Belgium according to that Schlieffen plan. And here's where the Germans fucked up. It's literally right here. So Britain, and I know I haven't been talking about Britain in a while, but now they're relevant. Britain had already asked Germany to leave Belgium out of their shit. But Germany obviously didn't make that promise because it was already in their plan to go through Belgium in the first place, right, to get to France. So by invading Belgium, Germany makes it inevitable that Great Britain would jump in the war. Now, the Anglo-French Accords of 1905, that didn't specifically obligate Britain to help France in any way if they were invaded. But, as with a lot of these agreements, there's a lot of these like handshake deals that happen under the table. And the British government had given private assurances to the French government that they'd help them out if something went down. But, a lot of historians argue that the type of help that they would have gotten if they were just straight up invaded through the Belfort Gap would have probably been limited to just stopping the German fleet and like blockading them and stuff like that. Like not necessarily committing boots on the ground. But Britain's earlier treaty, their 1839 treaty, made commitments to uphold Belgian neutrality. That was very specific. Like their goal was to make sure Belgium stayed neutral. And since Belgium is now under attack, they could therefore not be neutral anymore, right? They're no longer neutral. So it gives Britain all of the reasons it needed to go ahead and put boots on the ground in mainland Europe, right? They were freed of their obligation to try and keep Belgium neutral. Yeah, Germany took that off the table for them. So remember the part I said a little while ago about German army being super mobile? Well, that's still a thing, and I want to talk about that a little bit, about mobilization in general. So all of the German rally points and arms depots were local, right? So think of it like, and it wasn't exactly like this, but one easy way to think of it was like every city, every town had a local arms depot and a local rally point where all the men that would be called up for the military would go to this one town center, and then they can go off to war. And that's important, right? Because once mobilization orders were given, a military unit could be assembled they can give them all their guns and sent them off on their way within 24 hours. Now, you add that to the fact that Germany has an extensive and efficient rail network. This means that the German military unit that got, called up could be on the front within 48 hours, right? So that's fast, even for today's standard. Like 2 days, and they can be on the front. That's quick. France, on the other hand, their mobilization was much slower because the way that they set up their rally points for their French recruits were typically farther away, right? They weren't like in every single town. It'd be like one in the middle of fucking nowhere. And if you got called up, you'd have to take a train or, a long journey to that rally point, get armed up, and then you have to take another train from there to go to the front. And, at best, that difference would be 2 to 3 days slower than Germany would. So Germany does it in 2 days. France is doing it in like 4 or 5 days, right? And that really makes a big difference, especially in a war where Germans' literal plan is just hit hard and hit fast, right? So to top all this off, France's mobilization was already 3 to 7 days behind Germany's at the start of the war, right? They hadn't started mobilizing for at least 3 to 7 days beforehand. And this kind of made them shit their pants a little, right? Because they're like, oh, crap. They're already, like, once they started fighting with Belgium, they were like, oh, shit, we know what they're about to do. They're about to go hook around the north and come at us that way. They're not coming through the trap that we laid for them in the Belfort Gap. And we're having trouble. We're already behind, and we're having trouble getting people, to support the front. So Germany at this point is off to a really good start. But again, Belgium. I want to underscore that Belgium, nobody ever would argue that Belgium could possibly win against the Germans. But I got to give it to them. Those guys held up and held the Germans up for a very, very long time. So long, in fact, that it actually gave the British enough time to get from England, across the channel, through France, and up into Belgium to support the Belgians. So it gave them that. That's how much time they bought. Props to Belgium, but the Germans really fucked them up, though. And they committed a shit ton of alleged war crimes along the way. Some of them true, some of them trumped up a bunch.
That's when the British propaganda machine came out, and
exactly,
they labeled it. So I just typed in something weird. So I typed in rape of Belgium because I just wanted to see what the what the Wikipedia says deaths. So Wikipedia says 23,000 civilians died, or 23,000 civilians died. The weirdest thing about this Wikipedia page, rape of Belgium. Right underneath it says not to be confused with rape in Belgium.
That's funny.
It's just weird. But yeah, so I guess a good way to explain the fervor in Britain, because I think this is an important part of the story, is that it was the rallying call. Like, we need to support Belgium. It's a lot like how Ukraine is today, especially in Britain, where, I think support for Ukraine is even higher than it is in the United States. But it's like, that was like, if there were, T-shirts with Belgian flags, I'm sure it would be, all over social media. It's like, imagine if Twitter was back then. We're talking obviously it's wrong to invade a country, but we're talking about Belgium. Belgium is a brutal imperial country. Like,
at the time,
Winston Churchill was talking about, according to Winston Churchill was disgusted by Belgium and their treatment of the people in Congo. Like the story of King Leopold, King Leopold IV. Maybe I'm getting his wrong. King Leopold of Belgium. The rape of Belgium and like the horrible atrocities and treatment of the local indigenous populations there. We're like over another level than how other, colonial countries, handle that type of stuff. But it was one of the main center points I think, you had mentioned that there were secret handshake deals, and of course there were definitely secret handshake assurances, and the French absolutely expected the British to jump into the war if the war was to outbreak. It's interesting though, because, again, I mentioned earlier, there was a war party in every single country, and Lloyd George, the prime minister, was against the war at first.
Mm-hmm.
And he wanted to keep Britain neutral. There's a really good book about this, Pat Buchanan's book, where he writes about pretty much the fall of the British Empire, like the last remaining decades, and the policy mistakes that they made. Basically, his thesis is that the first chapter is about World War I. The rest of the book is all about World War II and a bunch of the mistakes the British made. But he writes that he writes a lot about how the Liberal Party, the party that Lloyd George was part of, was just totally swept into the war fervor. Mainly kind of pushed by the big war hawks were Churchill, of course, and the Foreign Secretary Gray. But it's just interesting that every single, and it's something that warrants more exploration. How does everyone have these different? Because I don't think we've even really touched on this. Like, how does these war parties just develop in these nations, where there's just people primed and ready to go? Is it just intense nationalism? Is it business interest? Because there's obviously business interest in Belgium neutrality, right? For the British, that's their closest relay point from the British over the British Channel to the European continent. So of course they want them neutral. But it's just an interesting question that deserves further exploration.
For sure.
We probably wouldn't be able to do enough on this episode on. For sure.
But I guess kind of coming back to it, in terms of the invasion of Belgium, and the things that the German army did in Belgium, for better or for worse, this gave the Allies a lot of propaganda ammo. And this propaganda ammo was definitely very useful to helping sway other countries to join their side, primary among them the United States, right? Which, was largely isolationist and wanted nothing to do with this European war, probably for good reason, but, that's probably a story for another time. My point is that the Germans severely underestimated the time that it would take to get through Belgium. And more to the point, they make a critical political miscalculation that the Brits wouldn't come to help Belgium or France. So, Schlieffen plan could have worked if Belgium had rolled over and if the Brits hadn't gotten in. But that's like too many assumptions that I think they made. And it's fascinating that the German high command just ate this shit up and we're like, yeah, Schlieffen, great plan. Let's do that. So meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, to talk about their mobilization a little bit, Russian mobilization was just as bad as France, maybe even arguably worse. Their Western Front was organized into 6 military districts, and each of those districts had multiple muster stations, but they were super far from the fronts. In some cases, in some of these military districts, the muster station was as much as 200 miles away from the front. And, 3 of these military districts were on the German front and 3 of them were on the Austrian front. So it's like splitting them between these two powers. So again, going back to the original German plans of tag teaming Austria. So they have to split their focus between 2 different countries. Also, very importantly, less than 1% of their roads at the time were paved. And people had to walk for miles to get to their muster point. So that really slowed things down for them. But despite being so slow, by design, the eastern fronts of, the German and Russian border were way understaffed by the German military, meaning they didn't commit a whole lot of forces to holding on to that. Remember, in the Schlieffen plan was like, hey, if they end up coming in early and they take some territory, it's like all good, we'll take it back, right? Like that was the plan. And all the time that they spent in Belgium just gave Russia way more time to mobilize, so much so that eventually Germany would have to start bleeding forces from the Western Front to shore up the Eastern Front. So that was the Schlieffen plan. And, I was considering keeping this going and, talking about how it panned out. But I feel like that's the war. And I want to leave that for, another 10 hours of content that we'll probably have to do.
Yeah. So the purpose of this series was not to do like a World War I podcast on the war and the battles. It was more so to just provide more context on, how the war happened. And it was complicated to do this because, we're dealing with a bunch of different countries. That's probably the hardest part. The things that made this challenging were two things. Well, there's many things, but here are the things I found most challenging. The fact that we're dealing with, primarily 5 different countries in Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, France, and Britain. Those are the countries. In Serbia, what am I talking about? 6 countries. I think we dedicated the most time to Serbia and Austria. That, and there's just so much information out there. So it's like you can get really bogged down and lost. So, hopefully everyone found this interesting and easy to consume. I'm certain that people are listening and are like, oh man, you didn't talk about this or that or that. I'm like, yeah, you're probably right. We didn't talk about that. And the reason why is because, we could do.
You tried doing a podcast on World War I.
Yeah, you do a podcast on World War I. Tell me what you come up with. But so far, the feedback has been awesome. A lot of people have been telling us that this is some of the best shows that we put out. So I'm happy to hear it. And let us know what you guys are interested in. If you want more series, if you like this type of method, I feel like this is one of the better series that we've done.
For sure.
We've come a long way from doing our Japan series to now in our Korean series that we never finished.
And even before that, I mean, our series front started with like those ancient history series, right? So that was around this time last year, I think.
That was like 2 years ago.
Yeah.
But we were doing the Korean War series, and then the war in Ukraine happened, which just totally broke my concentration on doing anything Korean War related. So
yep, maybe we have to get back into that. Who knows?
Yeah, I don't know where to go from here. But all right, guys. So this is the last episode of the year. We are working on new content and also just like holiday, Christmas stuff and spending time with family. So I hope you guys enjoy this episode. Make sure that you rate and review the podcast. That is the number one way to support our show. And I hope you guys have a happy, wonderful New Year and, happy holidays, Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, whatever other holidays are in this time period. Spend time with family. When holidays come, try not to think too much about politics. I think that's a healthy thing. Always take a mental break from political rhetoric and I think too much politics is can really hurt your brain after a while. I think I went through that period during about 2 holidays ago after during like the election, and I was just like, fuck, I need to get out of it. I need to talk about like space pirate wizards or something. But yeah, Merry Christmas to all, Happy Holidays to all, and Happy New Year. Enjoy time with your loved ones, and we will be back in 2023. All right, peace.
Hello, everyone. My name is Wesley Livesey from the History of the Second World War podcast. Join me on a journey through the most destructive conflict in human history, a journey that will take us not just through the famous campaigns and cataclysmic battles, but also to the lesser well-known corners of the war that touched millions all over the world, as we try and answer not just the questions of what and where, but how and why. You can find History of the Second World War on all major podcast platforms or at historyofthesecondworldwar.com.